Jako fakt to ne, to jako opravdu, to nejenom, že ten Resident Evil 7 byl tak dobrý, že po té 6 se vrátil reputaci Resident Evilu. On ji jako umožnil efektivně prostě pokračovat v tom home runu, co byla ta 7, pomocí těch remakeů a najet na tu 8 a dál, no. Jak Resident Evil 7 zachránil Resident Evil? Ty pičo, proč jsem doslova ještě neviděl tohle video? Jako vyloženě s tím souhlasím, když si vzpomeneš, ty vole, když vyšel Resident Evil 7, v jakém stavu byla ta série. A.k.a. Resident Evil 6, Resident Evil Operace Raccoon City a další píčoviny. A plus ještě, že to jako prošli už po druhý, udělali úplnou změnu kamery a ovládání a prošlo jim to a vyšlo to.
A game's opening minutes embody all of the effort and progress that has been made on that project. In the case of Resident Evil 7, this opening cutscene encapsulates over 3 years worth of challenging work to overhaul the way Capcom used to build games. Every frame of this cutscene is also a testament to the hard work of a development team committed to taking the franchise in a new direction. Today, I'd like to tell you how one game drastically shifted the way a developer worked, and why this game is its most important release of the last 4 years. This is how Resident Evil 7 saved Resident Evil.
Tak hlavně to mělo i ten Resident Evil engine, který pak použili na další hry, na ty remakey, i na Devil May Cry 5 a všude fungoval superově.
Horror. Since 1996, it's been near impossible to have a conversation about horror games where Resident Evil isn't mentioned. By late 2012, it was the last man standing. 7th gen had wiped out what remained of its classic survival horror contemporaries, and even Resident Evil didn't entirely resemble its former self, having evolved a generation prior with the smashing success of Resident Evil 4. Though releasing to mixed reviews, its latest entry at the time, Resident Evil 6,
to IGN k tomu prostě najebalo skoro 8 z 10 stejně. They will never change.
Also been a success. However, these reviews would go on to inform Capcom that all was not right with the franchise. You see, Resident Evil were...
Resident Evil 6 je Michael Bay film.
You see, Resident Evil were survival horror games that sold like shooters or action-adventure titles. They were anomalies in their own genre. Even its second most recognizable franchise, Silent Hill, sold respectably, but considerably less. Resident Evil 4's directional shift came largely due to the sales of 0 and the remake of 1, both on the Nintendo GameCube. They did not
vydat to na GameCube a ještě vydat takovou otravnou sračku jako Resident Evil 0
must be taken with the games to
a čekat dobrý prodeje.
the previous sales of numbered titles. Resident Evil 4 brought an increase in action to the franchise, which made it more accessible and allowed it to garner larger sales. With larger sales come larger budgets. And by the time...
Jak prostě rychle sprintí a pak rolne do toho šutru a stejně to přežije.
And allowed it to garner larger sales. With larger sales come larger budgets.
And můj bože, Ševa.
By the time Resident Evil 5 rolled around, the franchise was not competing with any other horror games, it was competing with the big boys like Halo and Call of Duty. 5 was an even bigger success than 4, but it led Capcom to determining that Resident Evil was too big for the survival horror genre, and needed to break into the North American market significantly and consistently to be financially viable.
Tak když to vyjde v roce 2009, kdy bylo Call of Duty na svým absolutním píku s Modern Warfare 2, a ty akčňárny prostě a military shootery byly jako regulérně totální hit. Oni chtěli furt, aby to byla mega prodávaná série, tak to prostě nemohl být, jak by řekl Čeklad, níž hororový survival žánr. A ještě u té 5 to jí docela jako šlo, ten koop je tam v pohodě, ale ty pičo, pak to 6.
In a 2012 interview, series producer Masachika Kawada, who had just finished working on Resident Evil Revelations, had a number of interesting insights on the franchise's departure from survival horror. Looking at the marketing data, the market is small compared to the number of units Call of Duty and all those action games sell. A survival horror Resident Evil doesn't seem like it'd be able to sell those kinds of numbers. RE4 started in that direction, and RE5 kept going in that direction. And I think that, especially for the North American market, we need to keep going in that direction. And take that
ano, půjdeme tím směrem, uděláme operaci Raccoon City.
Step further. And that's exactly one of the reasons that Revelations is the way it is.
Ty vále Resident Evil Revelations je teda jako mnohem méně akční než Resident Evil 6.
But I don't think that it necessarily has to go all the way in that direction, the Call of Duty direction. It doesn't have to be a straight-up shooter. With all of this in mind, Resident Evil 6's approach to integration of mechanics and pacing from various genres of games is not surprising from both a critical and financial perspective. If you want a game to sell as many copies as it can, making it appeal to as many people as possible makes sense. The problem with Resident Evil 6 is that in trying to be so many things, it lost the focus needed to excel at any of them. This is why, despite a monstrous 5.8 million copies sold at the time, it still could not match the numbers Resident Evil 5 did. And when you consider that 6 almost certainly cost more than 5 to make, this presented a problem for Capcom, but not one it would immediately work towards fixing.
Chris odchází za kamenem na konci tunelu, aby ho zbil.
Resident Evil 6 released in October of 2012.
V té hře je nejironický cutscéna, kde on rozřízne jabko na perfektní hvězdičku během cutscény. Protože je super rychlej. A zase na druhou stranu, kdyby to udělal Leon ve 4, tak se zasměju a řeknu, že to je geniální, takže jako to je asi nějaký bias.
October of 2012. But Resident Evil 7 didn't begin full development until April of 2014. What happened in that span of time changed the franchise forever once again. Though likely hesitantly given the sales and reception of 6, it was decided internally that Resident Evil 7 would continue in the same direction. So an undisclosed team of Capcom developers began working on a version of the game. Sometime in late 2013, this version was determined to be not optimal. Masachika Kawada said that it wasn't really coming together, and the state of the game drew the attention of Capcom CEO Kenzo Sugimoto. He thought the series was in trouble.
Čili kolik lidí tady je na streamu ve 3 ráno a konzumují tento velice zajímavý obsah o oblíbené sérii? Napište very pok do chatu.
Called on one of Resident Evil 5's producers, Jun Takeuchi, to solve this problem. A responsibility that Takeuchi accepted almost immediately. Takeuchi worked on the very first Resident Evil. He was no stranger to the franchise or the challenges brought on by the growing scale of AAA development, having shipped Resident Evil 5 4 years prior. What made Takeuchi special was his commitment to his vision. He was asked to take care of Resident Evil, and though making the best game possible was of utmost importance, he was also tasked with bringing Capcom's efficiency standards to par with other modern developers. His first goal was simple.
Čili jako teoreticky v 60 bych se možná mohl dočkat.
Takeuchi asked himself what Resident Evil actually was, and came to the conclusion that the new Resident Evil must be a horror game. He also immediately decided that the game would be in first person to further immerse the player in its atmosphere. Takeuchi's ideas were radically different than what Capcom had just released, so he sought out team members that were on board with a return to survival horror and who got his ideas. The first member of
Čili oni na tom začali 2014. V roce 2014 vyšlo na PlayStation jistý hororový demo druhý slavný hororový série spolu s Resident Evilem. Od nějakého borce, co furt dává na Twitter nějaký funny fotky v Joy Division triku. Je možný, že se na to prostě podívali a řekli si, to mě poser, to je hororový jak čurák. K tomu se musí Resident Evil vrátit. Až na to, že na rozdíl od prostě Konami to actually udělali.
Koshi Nakanishi, who had previously directed Resident Evil Revelations and was excited at the prospect of making an intimate horror experience.
Dead Space už dávno byl a Dead Space je jako ty vole z first personu, který díl.
5 or 6, Takeuchi knew that the project would face many challenges, and the second member of the team was a project manager, Makoto Kodono. Though initially joining Capcom as a programmer, Kodono was also known as a project fixer at Capcom. He had gained the nickname The Slasher for how quickly he would identify problems with production and cut ideas if he thought they would present long-term issues. With a director and project manager found, Takeuchi knew that he needed people that understood how to budget and market this vision of his, and he chose 2 producers. The first was Masachika Kawada, who believed Takeuchi was right in his belief that it was possible to combine the best aspects of classic Resident Evil with cutting-edge technology. The second was Tsuyoshi Kanda, who had worked for both Capcom and Capcom USA, making his experience in international marketing essential to the project's success. And with this team of less than 10 people, Takeuchi's second goal was now attainable.
Ale mluvím o tom, co je inspirovalo k tomu udělat ze sedmičku takovou, jakou ji známe. A to rozhodně nebyl Dead Space, protože ten third person přece, kurva. A šel do mnohem víc akčnějších vod 2 a 3. Čemuž se chtěli vyhnout po Resident Evil 6 a 5.
The small team created a short cinematic to get all of the project's concepts across as directly as they could. This cinematic, taking place in a rundown house and featuring a single scare, got the message across loud and clear. It was a hit with other developers, but the business side of Capcom raised a number of questions because it deviated so heavily from what the franchise had seen before. Takeuchi quelled these worries during his presentation to them by laying out that the project needed to be narrow yet deep.
Já jsem hrál Resident Evil 7 celé ve VR. No
VR bude na 8 konečně teďko.
Hra mi zabrala půl roku, abych ji prošel. Ale ten zážitek ve VR je úplně někde jinde. Za mě, jestli jsou top hororové filmy, tak je to nic. Vyzkoušejte to projít ve VR.
Jako já si do dneška prostě pamatuju ten první playthrough Resident Evil 7 na streamu. To bylo jako šílený, těch jumpscarů tam, ty vole, a to, jak kurevsky dobrá je ta atmosféra a všechno. Jako opravdu ty lidi, co hráli Resident Evil 7, úplně poprvé na First Feel, v tom VR-ku ještě PlayStationovým, no ty pičo, ty regulárně se musí občas probouzet, ty vole spocený v noci, když na to vzpomínají.
Resident Evil 7 as a non-open world, single-player horror experience that would not require online features because they explicitly conflicted with the anxiety and fear the game would create in the player. He thought that this was what Resident Evil 1 was about and that it was the essence of the franchise itself. His confidence and the team's well-prepared game design document convinced the suits, and the project was fully approved. Finally, Takeuchi's third and final major pre-production goal was at hand.
Resident Evil 7 je lepší nebo Resident Evil Village? Hele, gunplayově a střílením a upgradema je určitě lepší ten Village. A je dobrý i tím prozkoumáváním vesnice, tím, že prostě ta mapa, že se do ní vracíš a je to víc v tom ve stylu té 4 s tím jako prozkoumáváním toho prostředí. Ve všem ostatním mám radši Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7 je komornější, ale v dobrým. Má výborně udělaný všechny ty hlavní postavy a mají tam všechny dost prostoru za mě. A jako atmosféricky je to prostě je to strašně dobrý a není to ani nějak jako šílený, jako právě byly některé ty staré Residenty a ta 8 je dost už jako v některých částech zase jako hodně šílená, hodně přehnaná, hlavně v tom finále. A samozřejmě taky jako 7 je ještě v kombinaci s tou atmosférou a s tou komorností je dost hororovější a sklíčenější a jumpscareovější. Ta 8 je jako tam má 1-2 jako děsivý pasáže, jinak je to vlastně v pohodě.
Game development had obviously changed immensely since 1996. In those days, Resident Evil was headed by the legendary Shinji Mikami.
Shinji Mikami, the man, the myth, the legend.
Ahead of his time than his games would let on.
Podívej se, jak kurevský cool byl ten Shinji Mikami, když dropnul tu RE4. Vyloženě on se vrátil z premiéry japonský, finálního Matrixu a pak dropnul RE4.
In both Resident Evil and Dino Crisis, he had various ideas he wasn't able to implement because the technology simply wasn't there or required too much work to realize and implement in a timely manner. Fast forward to 2014, and the same challenges confronted Takeuchi and the Resident Evil 7 team. Takeuchi believed that a generic, all-purpose game engine was not suitable for RE7. He needed something tailor-fit for the ideas he wanted in the game, and also something that would remain useful and relevant for years to come on later titles. Resident Evil 6 used MT
engine, který se pak použil i na Devil May Cry 5.
To address efficiency issues that Capcom faced in the early 2000s. It powered nearly all of Capcom's releases from 2006 onward, but by 2014, even though the engine had received a number of updates to keep with the times, it had itself become an efficiency liability, and was limiting the amount of achievable gameplay and visual elements that could be added or brought to life in a project. It was also during this stretch of time that North American developers had put significant work into streamlining game development with engines that were not only able to create photorealistic visuals, but also contain...
U osmičky je docela problém, že absolutně tě nezajímá hlavní boss, ta Mother Miranda, ten charakter nepoznáš, tak aby si k němu měl nějaký vztah. Takový hlavní problém nebo takhle, ne problém, hlavní záporák té sedmičky vlastně je taky jako ta Evelyn, že jo, kterou regulérně jako tam jí poznáš až na tom konci, opravdu jako o co jde. Ale je to tam jako líp setupnutý. U té Mirandy tam máš LMAO, ona je vlastně tady, v této izolované vesnici a hradě. Už jako někde od roku 1920, nebo kdy ty vole Spencer, který je od prvního Resident Evilu, který vyloženě přišel s tím T-virem a začal s Umbrellou, tak ten se s ním potkal někde ty vole na severním pólu, prostě na expedici. A ona se rozhodla, že bude jako prakticky 100 let, že se zase zašije do nějaký zasraný vesnice a nikdy na ní nikdo nepřijde a nedopadnou na ní události prostě z okolního světa, kde se děly události všech těch Resident Evil her. Včetně jako ty obrovský války ze 6, jo. A to oni neměli jako kam jít, takže to prostě řekli, že to jako hele, ty budeme to ignorovat a jakž tak to propojíme. Že ta Evelyn ta tam vlastně jako celou dobu je jako ta bába a ty si říkáš, ty vole, je to jenom bába na vozejku, nebo to jako dává nějaký smysl. No a potom na konci, když se to jako odhalí, že ta malá holka, ty vole, je celou dobu ta bába, tak si říkáš, hele, jako, ty vole, no. Takže ona vlastně celou dobu fakt jako u toho byla, ona tě furt sledovala, ty vole. Takže to jako bylo aspoň chytrý a cool. Ačkoliv prostě ty nejvíc cool záporáci, tam byl papáček, že jo. A pak ještě kokotko Lukas, aby to dohnal ještě v DLC.
Takeuchi needed this level of innovation, efficiency, and control with the tools they were using, but with the flexibility to create anything he or the Capcom production team needed. He didn't want an engine that worked for everyone. He wanted an engine that worked for Capcom, and so the RE engine, RE standing for Reach for the Moon, began development alongside 7. The team's plan was to begin by using a generic all-purpose engine to Greybox and then port everything to RE engine in a year. Greyboxing is the process of blocking out or blueprinting a game's levels in a crude manner to understand their design, scale, and overall playability.
Pak se divíš, že ty v obou dvou těch posledních Resident Evil hrách se ti furt děje něco s rukama a tomu Ethanovi. Oni jsou tak pyšný na ty animace těch rukou, toho Ethna v 7. a 8, že to dali doslova jako logo toho engineu.
After 7 was formally approved and the decision to create RE Engine taken, the RE7 team expanded to around 50 members. During this period of further pre-production, Takeuchi had a number of rules for the team that were established to create an effective trial and error system. The first of these was that anyone, from programmers to artists, were free to present ideas about the game's design. The second was that no one should feel tied down to previous RE games, and that they could try new things without fear. The third was that team members shouldn't concern themselves with what anyone else thought of their ideas. If Takeuchi thought it was a good idea, it was. All of this was done to create independence. Takeuchi wanted them to be self-sufficient so that they could both iterate and squash ideas amongst themselves. By rapidly going through so much of what worked and what didn't, they would save a great amount of time by having a clearer vision of what to move into final production and how to complete it once there. This was all overseen by Nakanishi, who gave the team 2 to 4 week stretches of time to implement the team's and his own ideas. These stretches of time are otherwise known as sprints, and this method of software development where every member of the team addresses and solves problems is known as Scrum. Scrum was used because Takeuchi saw trial and error as a necessity for the project's success. By using it in pre-production, he was able to ensure a wealth of polished ideas made their way into the game. Of course, with members of the team not yet confined to specific roles, they all influenced the game's story, which at that point had a much lower priority to the game's mechanics and hadn't been written yet. For example, the part in the game's opening sequence when Mia cuts off Ethan's hand is the result of the art director's complaint that the beginning of the game lacked some punch. However, to even reach the game's final opening,
Woodface, ta úvodní scéna, jak tam
jedeš
jedeš přes to úplně hnusný prostředí.
Weren't married and didn't know each other. RE7's scrapped opening saw Ethan riding a taxi to the Baker house as he was an investigator in search of a missing person, that being Mia. In this cut sequence, you can see Ethan grabbing his phone that displays an image of a woman. This woman is Manuela Velasco, who starred in 2007's Wreck, a fantastic found footage horror film. A genre of horror which Resident Evil 7 proudly emulates with its various playable videotapes spread across the Baker residence and general VHS era aesthetic. When Takeuchi approached Nakanishi to direct RE7, he told him he wanted a game in the spirit of Sam Raimi's 1981 classic, The Evil Dead.
Doslova jsem to říkal, když vidíš to auto a vylezeš z něj, že to je auto z Evil Dead. Už jsem to hrál poprvé. Kor ještě, když jedeš někam do Jižanskýho, ty vole, hraje.
And a small part of the team got permission to go to Louisiana to do on-site research. This is where an indispensable technology would emerge and begin to change the game's workflow.
Tu Quarantines to jmenuje, ale to není tak dobrý.
You've no doubt been blown away by a game's visuals at some point in time. Today, games look more realistic than ever, thanks to advancements in graphics processing power and several refined technologies and techniques that accurately recreate aspects of real life. Among these is a technology named photogrammetry. Photogrammetry is the process of extracting two-dimensional data from photographs and using it to create three-dimensional objects. While not a new technology, photogrammetry has taken hold in the video game industry and has helped produce very lifelike portrayals of characters by scanning in the faces of their actors. Keanu Reeves in Cyberpunk 2077, Norman Reedus in Death Stranding, and Courtney Hope in Control are just some of the amazing results of photogrammetry. However, photogrammetry is not just for scanning people. In games, it's also widely used for scanning terrains, structures, and objects. Takeuchi was, as mentioned, brought in to fix Resident Evil. This did not just include the direction of the franchise from a gameplay and presentation standpoint. It also meant addressing a number of issues with the manner the games were being created under the hood. While RE-Engine was an obvious step in the right direction, there was still the matter of asset creation, which had previously plagued Resident Evil 6. Each object in that game was created from scratch and tirelessly worked on by multiple people. It was such an immense undertaking that the team wasn't sure they could do it again, especially with the increasing graphical fidelity of games. Understanding this dilemma, Takeuchi gave the technical art team a number of demands. He wanted 7 to have the shortest development cycle of any Resident Evil. He wanted the game to have the most amount of assets ever produced in its history, but he also wanted the least amount of people ever working on it. And finally, he wanted the most photorealistic visuals of any of the games.
To jsou jednoduchý požadavky celkem. Ještě měl říct, že to chce za nejmenší peníze.
There was a single answer to Takeuchi's requests: photogrammetry. By using this technology, they could not only create incredible lifelike visuals, but because they were scanning in objects, they no longer had to painstakingly make them from scratch. There was still an amount of cleanup work to be done on scanned assets, but nowhere near the amount required in comparison to how assets were made for RE6. There was just one issue. In order to create their photogrammetry pipeline, the art team needed a proper scanning studio. Photogrammetry requires, among many things, an array of cameras taking photos of an object from every conceivable angle. The team needed around 150 cameras, in addition to all the other equipment, so Fukui and his team came up with a number. They were all worried this number, because of its high cost, would get rejected. So they compromised and lowered it to something they felt would get the green light. When Takeuchi saw this altered number, he said, "Is that really all you need for a studio? No way. Tell me how much it really costs." Takeuchi knew that the fewer cameras available, the less impressive the results using photogrammetry would be. His high standards could only be met if the team had the proper tools. Fukui gave him the real number, and it was approved. Photogrammetry is responsible for a large chunk of what we see in Resident Evil 7. Its characters, its atmosphere, its soul is the result of the search for efficiency. A search that wouldn't be over just yet. Now the year is 2015. The foundation of the RE engine is complete enough to support porting the team's existing work on Unity. The part of the team responsible for the gray box is split in two, and divided among those who would work on porting and those who would continue grayboxing. Everyone in management, such as Takeuchi, Nakanishi, and Kodono, knew what this meant for the project. It was time to begin scrapping ideas. Scrum allowed the RE7 team to try everything, but now that work was being finalized in RE Engine, what worked stayed and what didn't was cut. This is usually a low point in a game's development cycle.
Co mělo být v RE7 a nakonec tam nedostalo. A já si řeknu, kurva.
During the middle of production. If it happened in the middle, they would end development on a creative high note, because there's still so much to be done in the middle that it's possible to continue pitching ideas. This would boost morale and keep everyone focused on the tasks at hand. Resident Evil 7 was growing at a fast pace, and even had to take on more project managers. At the core of all of this work was another of Takeuchi's demands. Resident Evil 7 would see no delays. To accomplish this, there had to be a change in the approach to development. Scrum was useful for the game's prototyping phase, but to move to full production, the team needed to adapt what's known as the waterfall model. The waterfall method of software development sees delegation of tasks with developers locked into specific roles. It's the traditional method of game development that sees different teams working on jobs and then handing them off once complete. But for RE7, there would be a twist. There was a worry that all of the ideas from the gray box wouldn't come together cohesively or promptly. This is because in the waterfall model, you have to have one team finish their work before another team can begin working on those assets, or you risk that following team working on incomplete assets that can cause any number of problems. With the RE engine itself in an incomplete state, this was not a risk the team could take with the game's production. Kodono's idea to solve this was to just have everyone involved with the creation of that asset working on it at the same time. Instead of a modeler passing off their work to an animator, the modeler and the animator would work together to address potential issues and create the assets with everyone's expertise and priorities in mind. Kodono thought of this structure as similar to a factory production line. By assembling developers in these lines, programmers, designers, and artists could communicate what they needed and complete assets without any further work needing to be done on them except placement in the game's levels, for which another line was also created. It was this twist on the waterfall model that allowed them to work on the game at a blistering pace, and even though they ran into problems, they were solved with relative ease. That was until they got a package in the mail. The scope of RE7 was laser focused. It had been planned that way by everyone in management. On the day they received a development kit for Project Morpheus from Sony, later becoming officially known as PlayStation VR, there was great...
Muselo to dělat nejméně lidí, co dělalo Resident Evil. Muselo to být za nejkratší čas, co byl kdy Resident Evil. Nesmělo to mít žádný odklady. A když už si mysleli, že ty vole, my to možná zvládneme, tak v tu chvíli přišlo, ty vole, ještě je čas, aby to bylo na day one celý udělaný na PlayStation VR. Což 8 nemá více jak rok po vydání furt.
Deliberation among the team.
Virtual reality was always in the back of the
minds of the RE7 team, but its priority dwindled as the months went by, and adding another moving part to development is always difficult. Kazuhiro Takahara, a programmer who had joined the RE7 team in 2014 and was working on RE Engine, was a VR enthusiast. He and a number of others on the team had a great liking for VR and thought it would fit RE7 well. With the tools finally available to them, Takahara pitched Takeuchi on implementing VR for the game. Takeuchi was not fully on board.
Teď dělej! Tvé, jak jsem šerty počkal prostě až na konec videa v půl čtvrtý ráno, aby to tam easy peasy snipnul. Šerty, díky za 2,5 tisíce korun českých. Megamagore. Já nikdy nic nevyhrál. Chci ten hrnek. Jasné, dojedu video a jeden hrnek se řítí přímo k tobě, bratře.
But allowed them to experiment to see its merit and viability since it was a technology he too had interest in. In short time, Takahara and the unofficial VR team came up with a number of concepts that Takeuchi deemed no good for RE7, because they were too focused on VR itself and not the game. With this criticism in mind, the VR team created a demo called Kitchen. In this demo, Peter and Clancy from the Sewer Gators tapes are killed by Mia. It's short, but effective for VR demonstration purposes, as it prohibits the player from moving and allows them to only experience the brutality of being stabbed. The demo was a hit at E3 2015 and proved that virtual reality made sense for RE7. Following its success, Takeuchi decided that RE7 would be fully compatible with PlayStation VR. Though this would present a number of new challenges, RE Engine could handle it. VR support for the engine was added in a little over 2 months for the Kitchen demo. It was a very tight schedule to make sure...
Tohle jsem kamarádům dával zahrát tak, že jsem jim svázal ruky gumičkou, aby měli top zážitek. Co ti jebe, tyjo.
That it could be done right and wouldn't affect other aspects of development. It's worth noting that while Takeuchi had faith in VR and ultimately greenlit the entire game to support it, he couldn't actually experience it. Despite this, he understood its importance and benefit for the project, one he had been working on at that point for over a year. With VR support implemented and a very refined method established of building the rest of the game, the team set record pace, and by the end of 2015, the core of RE7 was almost complete. Though it would need more work throughout the next year, the game Takeuchi envisioned in 2014 could finally be shown to the rest of the world.
Docela nudná reakce, no. Hold to není Fallout 76, chápu. 24. září, teda ledna 2017. Jo.
The day Resident Evil 7 was revealed at E3 2016 was a tense one. It was time to see if everyone was right. Takeuchi spent the morning pacing the Capcom office in Japan, while Kawada and others in management were at the announcement in the Los Angeles night. They had all spent the days prior carefully putting together the game's trailer. Takeuchi specifically wanted the title drop at the end, so the audience would be intrigued and ask what the game was, something that would be answered with very clever typography. When the cheers rang out, the team was vindicated. They chose the right concept, and it was accepted. But the trailer didn't just end with the announcement of a new Resident Evil game. There was also a release date to go with it, January 24th, 2017.
No delays.
With the relief that the game's reveal was received well, the team had to finish the job. Kodono ended up getting the game content complete and then polishing it. Like with any game, RE7 had a number of bugs and other issues before polishing that ranged from comical to game-breaking. Bugs weren't the only issue, however. There were a number of discussions about the game's opening and other scenarios that needed changing. Changing things like these so drastically when the game was so late into development would of course present more work for the team, but it was done regardless. Everyone working on the game was dedicated to making it as good as it could be, no matter what had to be scrapped or the amount of work needed to complete it. Not to mention, the majority of overhauling had already been done. Prior to the game's announcement at E3, significant areas of the game were reworked and some outright remade. The most important of these being the second half of the game, which had problems with pacing and maintaining the terror that the team had spent so much time crafting in the game's first half.
Ty vole, takže oni ještě než to vyšlo, jak už si uvědomovali, že ta druhá půlka, teda hlavně ta část na lodi, má jako problémy s pacingem a že to prostě to je jediná část, podle mě, kde ten Resident Evil 7 jako drhne. Ty píčo, tak to bych chtěl vidět, jak ta hra vypadala předtím, než jako ty vole to ještě stihli jakž takž opravit do toho vydání.
Agreed that there were problems with it, and it was remade. So, by the time the game's announcement came, it was already in far better shape than it was at the start of 2016. And by the end of 2016, October specifically, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard was complete.
Docela pohoda. Stihli ty vole to, měli ještě listopad, prosinec a celý leden skoro.
Tell and roadie. Go tell and roadie that everybody's dead.
Resident Evil 7 was the world's introduction to Ethan and Mia Winters, the Baker family, and the Muramaiseat. It was also the start of a new chapter in survival horror. By combining the gameplay of classic Resident Evil with modern presentation, Resident Evil 7 breathed new life into the franchise. As of October 8th, 2021, Resident Evil 7 has sold 10 million copies. And while this is certainly the type of success Capcom was hoping for, it did more for the company than anyone would think a single game could. For all of its triumphs, I think that making it easier for its developers to create games is its crowning achievement. After Resident Evil 7, the reach for the Moon Engine would go on to be used in Devil May Cry 5, Monster Hunter Rise, the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3, and of course, Resident Evil Village.
Jako to, že oni nejenom, že stihli udělat ten Resident Evil 7 tak rychle, ale zároveň postavili ten engine a ten systém toho vývoje tak rychlej. Tak prostě ty vole, oni regulérně udělali strašnou službu těm lidem, co dělali ty remakey a díky tomu mohli ty remakey vyjít tak rychle po sobě, že jo. V kombinaci ještě pak s tou 8 hnedka po nich.
Were created in a 4-year time span.
Jako fakt to ne, to jako opravdu, to nejenom, že ten Resident Evil 7 byl tak dobrý, že po té 6 se vrátil reputaci Resident Evilu. On jako umožnil efektivně prostě pokračovat v tom home runu, co byla ta 7, pomocí těch remakeů a najet na tu 8 a dál, no.
To the level of efficiency created by the engine and the technologies it integrated.
To je mega působivý tohleto, no. To je jako prostě zatímco třeba u CD Projektu, tam ten grind měli úplně šílený u Zaklínače 3 a u těch DLCček. Ale vydali je rychle po sobě a všechno to byly masterpiecey, ale prostě ty vole, jakmile šli do First Personu, tak se jim to prostě už jako neprotnulo. No jistě, už jsem si říkal, ty že už dlouho nebylo, že je 3:30 ráno, já dokoukávám video a 2 nebo 3 lidi se rozhodnou se přehazovat v top donu, o top donátorských hrnek, který je tady už více jak 2 měsíce v nabídce. Budu muset hodit nějaký nový top donátorský item. Já jsem chtěl nějaký triko se special designem. To nemám zadaný.
NEVIHRAJEŠ Agri.
No jistě, Timothy, ty vole, se prostě jednoduše probudil a co je ty pičo? Díky Timothy za 666 a co tu šporkasu?
Is all of its team's efforts, and that's true. Sometimes, however, it embodies more than the work on that game alone.
Po 25 letech v Capcomu cítím, že jsem konečně mohl udělat hru úplně tak, jak jsem chtěl, jenom já. Budeme muset někdy dát s Radovanem Resident Evil 7 znova. Já bych to udělal v roce 2027. Za 5 let bych to udělal. Udělal bych chat Radovan stream. Kdy bylo to vydání Residentu? 24. To vychází na neděli v roce 2027. To je na píču.
Resident Evil 8 Mommy Milkers Deluxe Edition is the 27th game in the Resident Evil franchise.
Teprve 27. pohoda. Píšu si do kalendáře, abych měl volno. Přesně. Tu děláme ze soboty na neděli a v neděli to když tak dojedeme, easy peasy. Ježiši Maria, jenom vidí, jakmile se díváš na tohle, tak vždycky prostě ti musí najet ty vole ten Joseph Anderson. S tím prostě, tohle bychom měli vidět předtím, než vyjde Ragnarok. God of War téměř masterpiece. Jenom 3hodinová analýza God of Waru. Pohoda, ne? Když se zeptám na jakýkoliv věk, prostě číslo, jaký je kód ve videohře, tak první co napíšou 69 nebo 420. To si... 6 místný kód ve videohře, to je, napíšu 69. Pojď to 69. Chat, seriózně jo, chat.